So Jesus, the same Jesus who will later on in Matthew make lots of bread out of a little bit, more than once, but twice, feeding the multitudes, is challenged today by Satan and says in response, man does not live by bread alone. It's not quite how I would handle a situation, but then again, I'm not God. Jesus begins today's reading in the wilderness. He's there for 40 days just after his baptism as part of the beginning of his ministry. Similar and mirroring the Hebrew people when they have left Egypt, have just become freed, and now they are wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and not because their GPS is broken. I find it funny that in both of these instances, the beginning of something marks a season of solitude in the wilderness. It does make me think how often in the beginning of our weeks, how important it is to come here or to be with God in some way, to just be with God in presence, to shore up our understanding of who we are in relationship with God and who we are in relationship with one another before we get back out there. The way of marking the beginning of something new. So the Hebrew people, when they were leaving Egypt, I see it as probably taking 40 years for a couple of reasons. They had multiple generations of trauma that they had to work through and be healed from after being enslaved for so long under Pharaoh's hand. They had to understand that God was the one who would provide for them and care for them. Which is why, for 2 generations, while they're in the wilderness, God over and over and over again says, I, the Lord, your God. It was this way of reminding the Hebrew people that they were God's. In a sense, they were God's children. And God was their holy parent, providing every day's sustenance, every day's water, right there for them, and ultimately providing this land that was promised to them. They were children of God. So when Jesus is having his little sparring partner match with Satan, and Satan keeps saying, well, if you are the Son of God, it's all about firming up for Jesus who he is. He is truly the Son of God. And so because he is the Son of God, he doesn't need to rely on his own power or own strength. He does not need to bow down to anyone else. He can rest comfortably knowing that he is the Son of God. This, in part, helps to understand the theology of Jesus then as the Messiah and the Redeemer and all of that theological stuff. But more importantly, I think for Jesus being both fully human and fully God, was about to go through a lot of challenges in the next 3 years of his ministry. And if he didn't firmly, 100%, without a doubt, know that he was the child of God, that he was the Son of God, that God was there with him, would he have been able, or would that fully human part of him taken control? I can't help but wonder. But this is why it is important to have that identity in God firmly placed. Speaking of sons, another little story for y'all about my son. My son, too, is often finding himself up against temptations and tests as any 4-year-old would. See, my son loves remote control cars, and his dad and I fail the test of not spoiling him by continually getting him more remote control cars. One of the problems with remote control cars is they need to continually be recharged. Most of them come with little battery packs or we use rechargeable batteries, which means when the remote control battery runs out, it needs to be recharged, which takes time, which a 4-year-old does not understand or appreciate. So often, my 4-year-old gets very mad at me that I am not like Jesus, that I am not a miracle worker, that I can't recharge a battery in a second. He gets mad. And yet, even when he is severely mad at me, you know what he does? As soon as I invite him to, he comes and crawls in my lap. In the midst of his wailing, in the midst of his temper tantrums, and boy, can he throw them, he sits in my lap, the very person he is mad at, because he knows that I can give him comfort in the midst of that anger. And we sit there and we wait and we wait and we wait until the emotions subside. And when he's ready, we do some breathing exercises, and we remind him now, one more time, that it just takes a little bit of time, and now I can distract him with some other cool toy or other remote control car that is working until it's ready. And I can't help but think, how much more does our holy parent invite us to come and sit on God's lap whenever we are in the midst of our own temper tantrums, because we as adults can still have them. They just might look a little different. And no matter how upset we are over anything, even if we are upset at God, we can come and sit in God's lap and find comfort there until we can move forward. This season of Lent and our part of our year of prayer here at Iona Hope, I'm inviting us to enter into a season of laments. Now, often, Lent is a time of confession where we acknowledge our own brokenness. Now, lamentations allow us to recognize the brokenness of the entire world, ours contributing to it more often than we like to admit, but that the whole world is broken. And that darkness does exist, and that we're all deeply impacted by that. But lamenting also is acknowledging that all that we are grieved by, that Jesus carried that Jesus carried that on the cross as he climbed up the hill to Golgotha, that Jesus knows the weight, the pains, the griefs, the laments. God knows all of that because God carried it, God's self. And in part, that's why it's so easy to go and to be with God in those times. Part of our going through this season of lament, I'm going to be using this book as part of the sermon series, Practicing Lament by Rebecca Eklund. It's a short little book. I strongly recommend it. And so today I just want to map out a little bit from chapter 1 and just basically what does a lament often look like? What are its parts or characteristics? And first we have invocation. It's our crying out to God. And in times we might choose to use different terms for that, how we want to acknowledge God's presence with us in that moment. And in some times, just like a child, when we're so grieved, we might not even have words. It might just be a moan, but it's calling attention to God that we are calling out. And in the second part is complaint. This is the part I have down very well. It's a part of actually naming what it is that we are grieved by. And sometimes this really takes courage to verbalize, to put name to what it is that is weighing us down, what it is that we see in the world around us that grieves us, or what it is going on in our own lives. There's lots of reasons why I can think we've been taught by society not to name those things. But if we look at Scripture, we can see all these examples of laments that encourage us that it's okay to name these things. And sometimes the simple naming is just acknowledging that we aren't aware of God's presence. God, where are you? Why aren't you doing something about this? And of course, in our head, we might know, we might have this faith that tells us that God is in fact doing something, but in that moment, our perceived reality seems to tell us that God isn't. And it's okay to say that to God. Where are you? How are you acting? Eklund, in her book, writes, lament makes room for the gap between the truth, such as the truth that God never leads us, and our own experiences, which may say that we are all alone. So simply naming what is weighing us down. And then the third part is petition. Not only is there the complaint, but then there's, okay, God, this is what I wish you would do about it. This is what I need in this moment. What is your request? And then lastly, laments almost always, but not always, has a but or a yet. This is the part of trust. This is saying, God, it's all crazy, it's all bleak, and yet you are God. But you are sovereign. But you are in control, God. I know I can trust in you. Sometimes this is more of our head again than our heart. It's a desperate clinging on in the midst of acknowledging that we're still in the process of seeing God restoring things. It's praise while we're still in pain. Eklund says, as she looks through a variety of laments, especially in the Old Testament, that these are not linear. Just as the stages of grief are not linear, neither are laments. That often you go back and forth between these parts. It doesn't need to be neat and orderly for God to hear and to understand. Lament is this way of clinging on to hope. Hope that the current reality is not the end of the story, that in the midst of darkness, yet God is here. And sometimes we can cling on pretty strong with our faith, and sometimes it feels like we are grasping desperately because there is no other hope. Either way, we're calling out to our holy parent. There's a whole book in the Old Testament called Lamentations, which is one long lament. And I encourage you this season at some point to sit down one day, to read through the entire book in one sitting. At moments it might feel like a little bit of a slog, but with so many of our books and our scriptures, it's so helpful to see them as a whole and not just as little pithy verses we get here and there throughout the year. One of the interesting things about Lamentations, the book, is that we never hear God's voice. It's this whole long wailing and no response from God. Eklund responds saying to that reality, saying that perhaps God is silent. Perhaps God is listening. I think about my 4-year-old. When my 4-year-old is in the midst of a temper tantrum, when in the midst of grieving some perceived injustice in his reality, I could talk myself blue in the face, and it would not make a difference. My very rudimentary understanding of psychology is when you get very worked up, especially as a child, but even as an adult, that rational part of your brain, the mammalian part of your brain, kind of flees away. And the amphibian part of your brain, the rudimentary part, the fight or flight part, is all that is functioning in that moment. So you could try to rationally talk to somebody when they're in this stage. It's not going to do any good. I'm sure you've all experienced that with a child at some point. Logic is not going to help. For my son, the best thing I can do in a moment when he is having out of control emotions is to just be present, to be his loving parent, to let him sit on my lap, to know that comfort in the midst of his crying, to listen, that he knows that he is listened, that he knows that his feelings have been heard, that whatever he's feeling is important and valued. How much more is God like that? That God takes us, listens to our wailing, listens to those moments when we are out of control, grieving, and doesn't try to correct us, but simply listens. To me, that brings comfort, to know that God is there, that God is always listening, that God hears my feelings and says, those are big feelings, and it's okay for you to have them. So lament is a prayer. It's a redirecting our grief, our wailing towards God. And in that, acknowledging that God hears it. My prayer for us this season of Lent is as Joel encouraged us during Ash Wednesday, to assemble as a community, to rend our hearts, to mourn together, to place all that it is that grieves us, all that we do not understand, in God's hands. For God is the Almighty. For God is sovereign. For God is our holy parent, who always